So with that, Rebecca, I will kick it over to you and you can kick off today's presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Doug, and thank you all for joining today. I'm really excited to unpack today's topic a little bit more. I know that with the headlines and as we're rolling into a new school year, weight is a topic that's on many people's minds, and there's a lot of things to know about what we can do to be helpful and what might actually be getting in the way of helping students really take care of their health. So today we're going to unpack that pursuit of weight versus health and provide a few ways in which we can really help students find lasting success. As Doug mentioned, my name is Rebecca Touton. I'm a dietitian, a personal trainer, and a certified diabetes care and education specialist. I practice in the Boston area, and my practice is really focused on helping people of all ages explore, understand, and shape their health behaviors to match their values and priorities. And so I like to say I blend science with circumstance, values, and just where people are at in their life. Today, we're going to focus on two key topics. We're going to do a deep dive into understanding the implications of using weight as a measure of progress and success. And then we're going to talk about more sustainable methods to help people improve their health by way of nutrition. I'm going to do my best to just focus on nutrition just for the sake of simplicity and time. But nutrition really does not exist on its own, and it's not the only thing that really impacts someone's health. So before we dig into the content, I want to take a moment to really reflect on that we're all on the same page, right? So we are all here because we care about children, and we're here because we likely care about health and we have an interest in helping people improve their health. But we all also come to the table with our own personal opinions, our own experiences, and that can really influence your approach and your preference for what support might look like. So as I talk today, I'm going to acknowledge that there may be some content that you're like, ooh, I don't agree with that. Or maybe it might make you feel uncomfortable. And for some people, it might make you feel downright angry or frustrated or even a little bit resentful. So I want to acknowledge all of those feelings. And I've had similar feelings as I've explored and expanded how I work in the nutrition field. You know, when I started my work as a dietitian and a personal trainer, I had my own assumptions. I had my own past experience, and it really colored my learning and the kind of support that I thought people needed. But I learned more and did research and really learned a lot from the patients that I work with about what actually helps things last. So I'm going to challenge some of those assumptions that you may have had about weight and health, and I'm going to encourage people to really think deeper about what it means to help people support their health with a review of the evidence. So imagine this, right? So imagine that you have 5 students that you see with a cough, a runny nose, and a red eyes. What's wrong? Right? So you may have your own assumptions. You might think, it's just a cold. I've had a cold. They can just take cough medicine and they'll be fine. And so while that might be true that they all look the same on the surface, that simplistic of approach of just saying, let's give them all cough medicine really didn't help the root of what was going on for each of those people. Because even though they may have had the cough, the runny nose, and the red eyes, some person might have been having an allergic reaction. Another person might have been crying because of the death of a loved one. Another person might have been purging or vomiting and you just caught them coming out of the bathroom. We live in the age of COVID. I feel like I can't not recognize that. And someone else might live with smokers. Giving someone cough medicine didn't fix the root issue of what was impacting them and their experience. And this is absolutely what happens in weight management approaches, right? We look at bodies, we make assumptions about the behaviors behind the body instead of really trying to understand the person in the body. Because honestly, yes, we have many people in many different bodies and many different shapes. And yes, some of those bodies might be larger. That doesn't mean that something is necessarily wrong with them. Yes, some of them might be living in larger bodies because of how they use food and exercise, but not all of them. And when we base our assumption that we know the right body for all humans, it gets a little bit messy because bodies come in different shapes, they come in different sizes. And so what I really want to focus on today is that a person's relationship with food and exercise can vary wildly for many, many different reasons. But what we're trying to do at the end of the day is to have more consistent health behaviors, more consistent ways in which they're taking care of themselves. And some of the ways in which we approach health from a weight focused perspective can actually be really counterproductive to helping people eat well for a long time. And I got to say, this isn't really just about size, right? Because any person can have the symptoms that we just mentioned. It isn't size specific. And so when we focus only on size as the symptom of something else going on in someone else's life, we really miss the root, that problem of what might be impacting someone and how we can be helpful. All right. So with that being said, we're going to get started. So we're going to spend a little time today unpacking two key assumptions. The first assumption is that we need to help people find the right weight and that any amount of weight is considered unhealthy. But really, what is the research behind this and how do we know if someone's weight is impacting their health? The next thing we're going to try to understand a little bit is how weight loss works. Many of us are under the assumption that if we simply create an energy deficit by eating less and moving more, then weight loss is going to happen in a linear way for everyone. And then there's also the assumption that if someone gains weight back or if they fail to lose weight in the first place, I mean, you can insert your own assumption that you might have, but people will often label things and they even label themselves as lazy, unmotivated, undisciplined. I'm doing it wrong. I'm not doing enough. But is that really the case? So we'll start by really thinking about what is the right weight? Do we have a good definition of that? So many people, including students, are really conditioned to evaluate their weight as a direct correlation of their success and progress in health. But there are some serious limitations to this. I mean, for one, weight is not static. If you measure your body at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, you're going to see a different number. And that doesn't mean that anything actually changed. It's just the fact that our weight is not made up of what we assume is just body fat. And often those quick weight shifts are the product of fluid and nutrient shifts within the body. And it really has nothing to do with body composition as people assume. The other factor we really have to take into consideration for our students is that it's really natural, normal, and expected for them to gain a pretty significant amount of weight right around the time of puberty. There's nothing pathological about that. That is the way that the body starts to prepare for not only the physical changes of growing up, having more muscles, but also the hormonal changes that come with the ability to reproduce. And the problem is that when we fear and suppress that change and teach children that it's not expected or normal, it actually prevents them from reaching their growth and developmental potentials. And our weight really changes as we grow. I mean, many students and even ourselves are conditioned to believe that they must maintain their weight without really realizing that they're not done growing really until they're in their mid 20s. But even then, your weight in your 20s is going to change as you have lifestyle and circumstance. And what we'll dive into next is that body composition. You can have two people with the exact same weight in very, very different bodies of what's underneath and what's in their body composition. So we dig into some of these things in the platform module that has just been or is going to be released to really focus on the idea body fat is not wrong. It's actually essential for temperature regulation, balanced hormone levels, better reproductive health, adequate vitamin storage, good neurological function, to have a healthy metabolism, and to help regulate blood sugar. We do need body fat. But our society has really deemed it as socially unacceptable, and I'm going to put it in quotes here, gross, because of beauty standards and some societal expectations. When you look at the research, and we only have this research in adults, but for men in general, they have an essential need for at least 3% body fat, and for women, that's closer to 12. But please don't confuse the word essential with goal, because essential is what you need in order to function and to actually have processes continue in your body. It doesn't necessarily mean thriving or healthy. I also included in this slide a chart of typical body fat percentages for adults, but again, this is not children because children's bodies vary widely. But where many merely misinterpret some of this information is that they think in order to be athletic, you need to be hitting these body fat percentages, when in reality, sometimes these body fat percentages come about because of the work that goes into being athletic. So it's not this cause and effect that people often assume it to be. So this often leads people to wonder, well, how do I determine the right body fat percentage? And I'm going to give you a word of warning. It's really not easy for the lay person to get an accurate body composition measure. The systems that we really have that are commonly available, like those scales that you step on, or even those handheld devices at the gym, they can vary wide, a lot, and they can be very inaccurate, not only because of the quality of the device, how much electrical current is running through it, but also by the person's nutrition and hydration status. So besides some of our more clinical applications where we can do DEXA, or we can even do things like more high quality bioelectrical impedance, that's where we can determine body composition. We really don't have a way of knowing what someone is made of. And so that's why people will often turn to another measure you may have heard of, which is called the BMI. The BMI is a system that compares a person's weight to their height, and it then plots that on a standard distribution curve. But if you know standard distribution curves, there are always tails at either end, right? So you have some people will be on the smaller end, there'll be a majority in the middle, and then there'll be some people on the higher end, right? That's not wrong or bad. That's just a normal and natural part of variance. It's worth knowing that the BMI curves were originally established way back in the 19th century and based on white European men as an epidemiological tool to try to look at entire populations. It was really never designed to be a tool to diagnose individuals. So it really doesn't say how much body fat someone has or whether or not they're healthy or unhealthy. But honestly, for this ease and simplicity, it's common for people to try to interpret whether or not they have the right body based on these BMI charts, and that's just not the way it works. It really misses the mark in many ways, not only because it's not a great correlation of body fat, but also because there's good evidence that BMI alone is not a predictor of health. There's a lot of evidence that shows that a person's health behaviors show a lot more for whether or not what protects them against different chronic conditions, upwards to the BMI of 35. So sometimes people say, "Oh, I'm overweight," or I'm in the wrong category," and I really have to challenge you to rethink that, because over what weight? We don't have an established norm for what a normal or a right weight is for any given person. Um, so then how can we define overweight? And just because your body might be a little bit bigger or be higher on this BMI number doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to have negative health problems. Our health behaviors and our circumstances are much, much, much more powerful. I also want to note that for those under the age of 20, so if you're in the school system, we do not use that BMI equation at all. We know that it's not accurate in the slightest. Instead, when we're in clinic, we use something called the BMI percentiles. But even then, it's not really a tool for diagnosis. It's more to understand an individual's trend. So what is the right weight for any given person is we don't have an easy way to determine that number. When I'm working with an individual to understand where they're at, it comes down to where are they living their best life? Where are they taking care of their body in different ways? And where are the ways in which we can work to improve? And then where does that body settle out? Another sticking point for some people is how much weight should change in order to improve health. So there's a lot of research and a lot of the guidelines that show that for most people, health is positively impacted and greatly improved with actually very small body changes if their weight is impacting their health in the first place. It's really just a small change of 5 to 10%. That's not only very impactful, but it also tends to be more sustainable for people over the long term. But really, the trouble is that in our society, it's less about health and more about looking healthy. So you'll see it in the literature as well that across the board, people are rarely satisfied until they're at the right cosmetic weight, which is more like 30% of their starting weight. And they really want it quickly, right? They want it tomorrow. And so when when people don't achieve that rapid extreme weight loss, they often give up on health behaviors that actually take care of their health because they deemed whatever they did as a failure. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides, but what I wanted to point out here are that there are a lot of biological influences that can impact our weight. And people often have a lot of questions about how these things work. when it comes to really looking at it from a nutrition perspective, we're trying to focus on improving satiety for people. So improving their relationship with food, that what they're eating, they're actually satisfied with and feel like they can kind of move on with their day. And satisfaction is not just biology, right? Like it's not about looking at the chemistry of food and saying, oh, there's fiber there, there's protein there, there's fat there. You're miraculously satisfied. That is an element of it, but satisfaction is also emotional. It's the person's experience with the food and even the experience that they have with their body. And we'll dig into that satisfaction idea a little bit later on in the slides. People also tend to have lots of questions about whether they should do low fat or low fat, low carb, high protein, all of these different things. And while there's some evidence to show that if you have adequate protein, not excessive, adequate protein in the diet, it helps sustain muscle mass as people are trying to kind of shift their body if that's what they're interested in. But really, there's no difference if someone is doing a low carb versus a low fat diet. And there's actually more evidence for women in particular that if you're doing low carb, that increases the stress for doing low carb and trying to do endurance exercise or more cardiovascular exercise, you tend to have a higher stress response, which is counterproductive to health and counterproductive as well to kind of managing our relationship with food. Another, big thing that people talk about a lot right now is intermittent fasting and how that might play a role in health. And there's really not good evidence for intermittent fasting actually helping with weight. What it does is creates a rule around when people can and cannot eat. But for most people, that intermittent fasting lifestyle is not sustainable because it doesn't match what it means to be a human and kind of working in our society. So I could go on about this for a long time, but for the sake of time, we'll talk about some of the other influences and get into the more of the meat of it. I think the other thing we really have to make sure to point out is that nutrition is not just a choice, right? There are other influences that direct or that impact our ability to do what we want to do with our nutrition, but also really directly influence our health as well, right? Things like getting enough quantity and quality of sleep. That makes a really big difference in how much food we're looking for, the types of food that we're looking for, and how we're using food in our day-to-day life. Stress is also hugely impactful in impacting not only our weight and where we're storing body fat on our body, but also our relationship with food, whether we're using food to kind of to numb out or check out, or if we've lost our appetite and now have lost weight as a result and lost nutrition as well. Physical activity gets a lot of attention, and research really shows that physical activity isn't a great way for people to try to lose weight. There's a lot of ways in which that backfires. That doesn't mean physical activity doesn't help health, right? Physical activity is still so important for health, and it's one of the protective factors that we talk about. But when you're trying to use physical activity to create that energy deficit, what often happens is that it increases your appetite, and people aren't sure what to do about that. Or they have an increased appetite and they have a psychological response where they say, ooh, I exercise, therefore now I can have, and now they're eating out of line with what their body is actually looking for and is in demand. So all that to say, our children are trying, and it's kind of terrifying the ways in which that they are trying. And I'll let you read the slide. I won't read it to you. Our children are well aware when their bodies don't meet social standards, right? That starts around the age of 9, where children are acutely aware of their differences, right? How they don't line up with others or what society thinks that they should be. And they're living in fear of weight gain. But that isn't actually changing their behaviors, right? And that isn't actually helping them live better. Because in our effort to be healthier by way of controlling weight, we really miss the mark on so many key points. We dig into a lot of these on the weight module on platform, but I'm going to give you some examples here. When people more and or improve the quality of their food, they may lose weight at first, right? When they exercise more, when they eat a little bit better, yeah, their weight may go down. But it's pretty well documented in the literature that anyone who loses weight pretty likely going to regain some or all of it back, even when they continue the health behaviors. That doesn't mean they did anything wrong. We don't get to choose our body, and our body wants to kind of maintain an equilibrium that's right for it. But often, because people regain the weight and the weight comes back, it causes them to do one of two things, right? Either they give up on the health behaviors with the belief that they didn't work or that they failed, or they intensify their efforts without realizing that intensifying the restriction that they're doing with their food and or the amount of exercise that they're doing has a huge cascade of biological and psychological effects that increase hunger, increase the fixation with food, and increase food obsession. And it really often positions food and exercise as a punishment, right? That eating is about giving up what you enjoy and exercise is about making up for what you eat. But I mean, as we all know, humans are really not designed to do and repeatedly do uncomfortable and unhappy experiences. We are pain adverse and we are pleasure seeking. Give me the give me what feels good. So if we really want people to continue to eat well and continue to move, it needs to be rewarding for the individual. And that reward really should go beyond the scale because, as we mentioned above, that scale is pretty fickle and really difficult to control and determine. And moreover, this focus on weight as the indicator for whether or not someone would benefit from healthy eating and exercise, it kind of excuses some people from the behaviors and it shames others into it, right? So people in smaller bodies are often given the assumption that they're healthy, therefore they can eat anything and everything and don't need to exercise. Whereas people in bigger bodies almost have to have performative eating where wherever they're in public, they're judged for what they are eating and assumptions are made about what they do. But the last time I checked, health behaviors are pretty universal. And too often these assumptions and the shame placed on individuals living in larger bodies, it keeps them from seeking and being part of social experiences and actually working on their health and working with healthcare providers. Because if you're constantly told to do the thing that you haven't been able to do, what are you going to do? Okay. So how do we help people? That kind of lays some of the ground of what we're thinking about, why weight can be a little bit limiting. And what I'm really proposing here is not to say weight doesn't matter. If you lose weight, you're evil. But to really shift the focus, right? Instead of trying to use nutrition to get people into the right body, right? To really work to help people find ways to live well and work towards their health and continue to work towards their health. But I would be really amiss to pretend that nutrition is the only factor here. As I said, I'm trying to focus just on nutrition, but in reality, individual health behaviors account for less than 30% of someone's health outcomes. And nutrition is like a teeny tiny little piece of that 30%, right? Because there's other things like tobacco use and alcohol use and sexual activity and exercise that also factor into that. So what we can do is help students improve their food quality, right? By really getting curious about all the different drivers that might be impacting that. And we can work to help them find personal joy in movement. We can help them manage stress and we can address student values that might be impacting their ability to do things like body image. Our students are in a unique place, right? Are in general where they are in their developmental, they're really we're trying to move them out of binary thinking, right? Because when students are young, yes, there's a tendency to really try to simplify concepts. So for example, I have two boys, they're 3 and 5 years old. And when they were young and still with the 3-year-old, I pretty universally teach them not to hit, right? It's a very black and white rule. You do not hit. But as they get older, and with the older one, I'm already doing this, I need to teach them that, there are circumstances in which you do need to hit. Like if you're in physical danger or if someone is trying to take you or harm you, fight back, right? But so it has to go beyond that black and white rule of do hit, don't hit, and help them understand there's a lot of gray area we need to consider. And as educators and coaches, we can really help students challenge and move beyond some of these limiting ideas that really often lead to inconsistent engagement in healthy eating and active living. Because it's really not about good, bad, right, wrong, before and afters, right? And I'll mention, our bodies are not static. I think often our students are under the impression that if they have a physical change, that change happens forever, right? Like if they change their food, they think, all right, I changed my food. I just have to get to this point and then I can stop and go back and do whatever I was doing before without really understanding that these are lifelong things that we continue to need to work at and progress at. And people also struggle with what we call cognitive distortions in what we call CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And these are often perpetuated by the media and even our diet society. The problem with, and so the thoughts like, this is the last time I'm going to have pizza. Really? Is that the last time you're going to have pizza? But when people have that thought that this is the last time they're going to have pizza, it leads them to believe that tomorrow deprivation starts. And it starts what some people refer to as the Last Supper syndrome, right? Where it's the last time I'm going to eat this, therefore I must eat anything and everything because tomorrow it all goes away. But that's not the way food works, right? It's not that black and white. It's not that binary of a circumstance. Other things like overgeneralizing, like saying this isn't working, right? Because if they haven't found a good definition for whether or not something works, right? Or how to actually measure their progress or how to feel good about what they're doing, it can lead them to jump to conclusions to not sustain the behavior that they're working on. Um, and of course, with a lot of the students, it's if I eat like them, I will look like them, right? If I eat like the girl sitting across from me at the table, I will eventually end up looking like them, right? Because there's, again, this overgeneralization that that person just looks the way they look like because of what they eat. And they don't really have the skills to really dig in and understand that person looks like the way they look like because that's the way they look, right? It could be a product of genetics. You have no idea what that person is doing besides that time you have together at the lunch table. So there's lots of things that we can do to help students kind of acknowledge these thoughts, be aware of them, and try to move past them. And I really want to encourage people to move beyond the eat this, not that, right? The cognitive approach. Because in general, I mean, people kind of know what they should eat, right? It really isn't a secret that it's probably a better idea for your body to have broccoli instead of Cheetos, right? But actually making that shift is really complicated, and shame doesn't often make it happen faster or for any longer, right? And it's really influenced by other factors like logistics, mental health, clever marketing. A really good Netflix documentary has a lot of power to disrupt a lot of people's eating, even if it has nothing to do with the evidence that we have. And also these unrealistic expectations, right? So we can really, and I'll talk a little bit about some of these, how we can help unpack them for our students. The reality is that healthy eating, I mean, it is pretty simple, right? It doesn't have to get more complicated than what you see on your screen, right? Grab some produce, fruits and or vegetables, add a protein, have a starch in some form. But not all meals look exactly like this. And some students really need help understanding how to get to this place or work towards this place in all kinds of circumstances, right? So again, students sometimes have this expectation that I should just be able to do this. If I can't do this now, then I can never do it. But that's not realistic. You can think of your own evolution with eating, right? Where did you start? Where did you go? What are the things you added? How did things kind of get to where they are? As you probably expanded your own knowledge library, as you expanded your skills, it gradually shaped what you ate. I mean, what I ate when I was in high school is dramatically different than how and what I eat now because I'm not the same person. But our students don't have that lived experience to be able to get there. So that's why when looking at nutrition chemistry can be really helpful. So in platform, the first lesson really explores the who, what, where, when, and why of macronutrients, which are the energy building blocks in food. Uh, I chose to explore these not because anyone should be counting them, and I'm fully aware that that's a really big trend right now. I don't think anyone should be counting macronutrients necessarily because our bodies are just not that precise. But the reason I like to talk about macros is because when you start to understand the chemistry of food, it makes food more neutral, adaptable, and flexible, right? So it's a starting point to be able to work with food wherever you are, right? So a student might be able to then go into a convenience store and say, all right, I need a quick snack before I go and play soccer. I learned in the platform lesson that before I play soccer, I really need more starch. I shouldn't be doing a lot of fat or protein because that's going to make me feel really crummy on the field. And so they can try to find options wherever they are that fit that chemistry, as opposed to a student saying, all right, I have soccer, I'm supposed to eat something healthy. What's healthy? Carrots. Well, carrots are a really terrible, terrible form of fuel before doing anything athletic, right? Yeah, are they good in other ways? Absolutely. But when we start to understand the benefits of the chemistry of food and how they interact with our day-to-day life, that's when we can make more powerful decisions to really feel good with the choices that we're making and want to continue to make them over and over. So some wheels might be turning and you're thinking, all right, it's time, you want to have them track their food, right? You're going to have them log into MyFitnessPal or Chronometer, any of the wonderful apps that are out there. But there's some really big limitations with that we do talk about in the platform module. One of which is that that information isn't always super accurate. But the bigger problem is that for almost a third of people, so 1 in 3 people, 30% who engage in food tracking and are asked to do it, end up feeling really, really bad about what they eat and feel more dysregulated with their food choices, right? So they're asked to track and they're restricting when they're still hungry and need the fuel to make up for a big workout, or they're not super hungry and they see that they've got a big gap in their numbers and they're like, oh, I can eat whatever I want, right? So it makes them really not listen to their body as well when they're tracking in this way. Tracking is great when you're curious, right? When you're just trying to kind of look at things and begin to understand chemistry, sure. But it's really not helpful when you're trying to micromanage what you're eating. I like questionnaires like this where it's just as simple as the time of day, how hungry were you, looking at the food and drink, how satisfied you were after, and any notes. And then asking them to think critically, not shamefully, but to really get curious about, are they are they getting the chemistries that they need, and are they actually feeling satisfied with what they're having, right? Are they eating more during the beginning of the day when they're more active, or are they waiting for everything after 7 o'clock, right? And why, right? To get curious about, well, why are you waiting until the evening hours to have that food, right? Or where they're kind of our food is not matching up with our physical activity. So I want to talk a minute about satisfaction, because it's one of the most important things I think we can really help people with and to help them be more consistent in their eating behaviors. So when I look at why we eat and how we feel after a meal, we look at two different components. We look at fullness and we look at satisfaction. Sometimes people are confused. They think, oh, they're the exact same thing, but they're not. Fullness refers to volume, right? So it's how much distension there is in your stomach, how much space the food is taking up in your stomach, right? Satisfaction is chemical and emotional, and it refers to the idea that you're done eating, right? You've had what you need and you feel like you can move on. So you can think for yourself, have you ever been full but not satisfied? And this is something that comes up for my students and my patients a lot. They're very good at using chemistries to feel full, right? They can fill their stomach, but they never feel like they're quite eating. So satisfaction really has these two, you can think of them almost as polarizing ideas, right? Especially when you look at it from a dieting lens, right? We have physical reasons why we eat. We need things like vitamins and minerals. We need energy. We need to support growth and development. We have to work on hunger. But there are so many more non-physical reasons that we eat that also support whether or not a meal feels satisfying, right? It's the taste, texture, and temperature of the food that we are looking for. It's whether or not the food is social, if it's cultural, if it's for pleasure, if it's part of an activity, right? Kind of correlated in that way, like an entertainment. If it's a celebration, all of these things matter. But when we fail to really look at those non-physical reasons why we eat, right? So too often people will go on a diet and they think, all right, I'm going to eat healthy. That means I'm only going to eat the foods that fit the physical things that I need. I'm only going to eat my fruits, vegetables, whole grains, etc. And I'm never going to eat anything that has to do with pleasure, right? Anything that has to do with social connections, anything that I just purely enjoy. And what ends up happening is that people feel so deprived, right? They put themselves on that diet and they're able to sustain it for a while until they feel so deprived of what it means to be human that they go to the other side and they kind of feel out of control with food. Right. And then they feel shame for feeling I'm going to put out of control in quotes, but really just enjoying food and eating the foods that they love. Then they feel a lot of shame. They have that last supper idea of, all right, tomorrow the diet starts. Tomorrow I'm going to stop doing all these things that really give me pleasure. And they swing back to the other side. They diet, deprives, they swing back, and they swing back and forth. And so what we're trying to do is help people get off of those extremes, right? To stop thinking about it as binary of either I'm eating healthy or I'm not, right? But to think about, how do all of these foods fit together? How do I give myself what I biologically need? But what are the taste, textures, temperatures, specific foods, the specific environment, the social connections that make me feel like this is a true eating experience that I'm satisfied with? So this slide in particular, I could spend 5 hours on. So Doug, whenever you want to do a 5-hour presentation, I'm all over it. But I wanted to point out that there are many drivers of what I'm going to call erratic eating, whether it's overeat, increased appetite, decreased appetite. But I want to really drive home that this goes beyond choice. This goes beyond, I choose to have a salad, right? Or I choose to have fruit. It really has, there are so many other factors that influence how people approach their food. Another thing that's particularly important to address with this population is body image, right? Body image is, it's not the same as self-esteem, right? So when you think about your, a self-esteem is how you think about yourself as the total package, whereas body image is really related just to, is a component of self-esteem, but it really doesn't fix self-esteem. And I think that's what sometimes people are trying to do with weight, right? They're saying, oh, if we just get you in the right body, you will feel better about yourself. And that's not quite the way it works. And there's actually a good amount of research that for people who have a poor body image, they have more erratic eating. So they tend to, when they change what they're eating, they may lose weight, but then they don't sustain the behaviors and they have a harder time actually being happy with any progress that they make with their health. So it's really important to talk to our students about body image, right? To talk to our students about how they're seeing their body. From that slide way earlier on, the people who are trying to lose weight are not people who are in the different BMI categories, right? The people who are often trying to lose weight are in the normal BMI categories, but tend to have that poorer body image based upon the things that they see in society or how they view their role in society. So you could get curious about who they're following, right? What are they learning from those people? Man, the what I eat in a day thing on TikTok is so tricky for people, right? Because too often our teens believe that what they see on social media is accurate, right? That the what they're eating a day is actually a true representation of what someone's eat, but in reality, it's probably not, and it doesn't mean they're healthy. And then there's also this really challenging thing with our social media experience for our teens is that the more followers someone's have, the more likely they are to believe someone is speaking the truth. But I like to follow some of these pages just to see what my clients are seeing. And I can think of so many examples, but my favorite is some influencer who has a lot of followers, a lot, way too many. And she posted about macros and how broccoli is a protein. Broccoli is not a protein. It has protein, but it is definitely not a good source of protein, right? I mean, to give you an example, it would take 3 cups of broccoli to equal an ounce of chicken. Like there's no merit in that, but it's how to counter some of these messages and help students see and think critically and go beyond the information that is pointed at them and helping them really understand more about it. And another thing, I know we all want to see that what we're doing matters, right? That's what we're doing makes a difference. And that's often the reason that we turn to weight, right? It's easy to see, it's readily available, it can change at a pretty quick clip. But as we talked about before, it really misses the mark on a lot of ways for health, especially for students. And we need to prepare students for the ebbs and flows that are going to come with changes in their body, right? Just because their body changes doesn't mean they need to restrict more or hammer harder, but to really get curious to figure out how to learn to take care of themselves. When you're looking to identify measures with students, you can look at things like physical performance, measuring it against themselves, not others, right? So are they able to walk farther? Are they able to walk faster? Can they do more push-ups, right? Seeing some of those, that physical progress can really help people want to show up again and again. With nutrition, it could be as simple as things like looking at the behaviors. How often are you eating vegetables, right? Where did you start? Where can we move you to, right? Not here's what you should, right? I think it's tempting to come at students and say, all right, everyone should be eating 5 cups of vegetables a day. Well, if someone doesn't have access to vegetables or doesn't have experience with that, that feels like a pretty marathon size goal. So instead, encouraging students to really look at what they're eating, to take that baseline and to say, all right, what is realistic for you? What do you want to try? Where can we work on adding more quality to what you're eating and focusing a little bit less on taking food away, right? Because nutrition comes from what we give our body, not necessarily what we give up. You can also look at things like cooking, right? To have them be experimenting in the kitchen and to feel like they have more options. Really challenging them to look at their environments. I've had other students who take this into an advocacy role, right? Where they say, all right, we've looked at our environment, there's no vegetables here. And they partner with some of the mom and pop grocery stores to see what they could do to bring in produce so that it would be an option. So there's lots of ways to get creative to increase access, to try to work on logistics, to improve confidence as well. It's a big job. And I like to think about this a little bit like building a house, in the sense that you don't do it alone, right? You really don't. And if you think of our students like a house, they all come with a foundation, and their foundations are not all in the same condition. Foundations are things like their relationships with themselves, their relationship with others, right? Some have crumbling relationships, right? They're really struggling to even find a solid foundation. And for others, that's a very solid foundation, right? They're feeling pretty good about themselves and their relationships with others. And the reason why it's so important is because we build everything we do upon that foundation, right? Every thought and belief that we have stems from that deeper foundation that was once laid, right? And then on top of that, our actions, our decisions, all the cognitive stuff, those are all they come out and are built upon, again, our thoughts and our beliefs. So it's all a big structure that's put together. Too often in nutrition, we want to focus on the decisions and the actions, right? We want to get to painting the house, right? We want to think about picking out colors. We want to think about decorating. But if it's really built on a crumbling foundation, it doesn't last for long. So it's taking the time, the energy, and the passion to come in there and say, all right, let's really look at your foundation. You may not be able to fix it. I'm going to hire someone else to do that, right? I'm going to connect you with the right tools and resources to be able to build a solid structure to the best of our ability. Because even the size of our foundation can vary, right? We don't all come at the table with the same thing. So we really work together as a team to work on some of these things. So when I'm working with clients, this is often the way that I explain it to them. I'm fully aware and I look at the foundation, I try to understand it, but that's not what I'm trying to fix with people. That's honestly where the work of a counselor comes in. But where I try to work is to understand that foundation and to understand what I can build upon it and how what I'm doing might be maybe hurting the foundation a little bit more, right? If that foundation is crumbling and I'm going to try to build a 6-story house on top of it, probably not the smartest move, right? But really working with the individual and where they're at to build the most sound structure that we have. Whew. So platform can be helpful in some of this. It's not going to solve everything, but it certainly can be a tool to start the conversation in a more objective way. Right, so there's 4 series that have been developed so far in the last couple of years. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Platform, for the opportunity to collaborate on this. The first series looks at the science of energy. As I mentioned, it looks at macronutrients. Part 2 thinks about applications, right? So how do you take what we learned about that science and apply it to our day-to-day life? Part 3 digs into hydration and some of the other nuances like vitamins and minerals and micronutrients, how foods serve us. And then this big release is a lot about the weight science and eating disorders and some methods to find more balance and with your food and movement for better consistency. So I think with that, it's a good reminder to just acknowledge and remove your own preconceptions, right? We all have things that we come to the table, like I said, with different experiences and different influences, and we want to be helpful. If we didn't want to be helpful, we wouldn't be here. But it's how to reconcile some of that information with the person in front of you and the people in front of you. And I recognize that that's hard to do because when you're teaching a large classroom or you have a lot of people that you're trying to touch, it's hard to try to understand where they are at individually and try to find a common lesson. But I challenge you to really find and explore, reasonable opportunities for critical thinking for our students. So to go beyond the eat this, not that, and that food is all about calories. It's not the most important thing. And to think about and identify, metrics that are within the control of the students and how they can track progress. So All right, Doug, with that, anything else I can do?
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much to Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's definitely a lot to unpack. And Rebecca, a 5-hour presentation on one slide. I would love to see what could come with that, because you do a great job navigating a lot. So we very much appreciate all of what you've done so far. I think one of the big things that stood out to me, as you mentioned, as you work through different types of things, is I think societally we live in a place where we think about what we take away and not what we give. But I think that's a really great kind of key insight. It's what nutrition is, what we give our body, not necessarily what we take away from it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. I'm just looking over questions here to see if we have anything coming through. So it's a big question, but just to sort of summarize it in a little bit of a way in terms of different kind of statistics and things presented out there, about kind of following the USDA dietary guidelines. Rebecca, if you could touch on kind of your thoughts on those, or how that incorporates into your conversations around nutrition or the education that we do.
Yeah, I understand people can have some hesitancy sometimes about the dietary guidelines, and there can be controversy. In general, they're a pretty good approach, because they are proposing that we work on having more produce in our life, right? More fruits and vegetables. And most Americans don't get that in their life, right? I think if it's still serving me, I believe it's like less than 25 or 30% of Americans actually get the amount of fruits and vegetables that they need in a day. I think sometimes people get really nervous about the amount of grains that the guidelines encourage people to have. But what gets really tricky about those guidelines is that what they're saying is a portion is actually much smaller than what people are actually consuming. So it's much more reasonable in that way. And there are things where, there's some flexibility where, dairy is something that's often promoted, in part because there's agriculture, of course, right? There are some political reasons there, but it's more about when you're having dairy products, you're getting protein, you're getting calcium, and it's possible to get those things from other sources, right? So it's, in the sense, I guess where I'm trying to go is that they're not prescriptive. It's not like you look at the dietary guidelines and you're like, okay, this is exactly what I am going to eat, right? But they're a pretty good general idea of how to get general nutrition information and education, and to have some critical thinking. They're pretty consistent with the literature. Does that help at all? Does that make any sense?
Sure. And another part of the question that kind of came from the top as you were answering that part, which was awesome, is sort of just talking about like the actual drivers of obesity and different things like that, and all of the different research that comes out there. A lot of today's presentation, you sort of talked about trying to separate the two, right? And like, even as we were creating a lot of our content for this curriculum and program, we were juggling and balancing, trying to have two separate conversations: health, obesity, weight, and all of the different kind of buckets within it. Obviously, we just did a full 45-minute presentation on trying to kind of like parse that out, and it's not like a perfect solution, but some of those things that we see referenced all the time in terms of what kids eat and everything else like that. What's the approach that you take in trying to like contextualize that? I think you touched on it a little bit with like taking smaller steps and not trying to like go to the very end of the equation, but how do you navigate that in knowing that there are a lot of things that are like they stand out, right? Things like the chemicals we put in our body and all these different things that do drive to some of those kind of health and wellness factors.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So the question is, right? How do you separate the need to address weight? Is that what we're kind of saying?
Exactly.
Okay.
Good. You always hold me to actually asking a real question.
So I think it comes down to getting curious, right? So if someone comes to me with a higher weight, for example, I don't make assumptions, and I don't make accusations that they're doing or not doing any particular thing. I think when you're looking at things like weight, there are many, many levels at which you can look at it, right? There is the societal level, right? Like thinking about like in the environmental, like what foods do people have access to? What are the cultural norms that someone might have? What are the past experiences that they've had? And then you have what the person is doing on just that day-to-day basis. I think if you're looking at the big political stuff, that's a little bit different about like what should be taxed. Sometimes I get those questions about like, should we have a soda tax? I'm like, I don't know. I'm worrying about the individual, right? So when I look at the individual, I want to understand, what are they doing? What is their circumstance, right? To get curious about what are the opportunities in which we can improve what they're eating. Are they having produce in their life? Are they having fruits and vegetables? How often are they eating? Are they skipping meals? If they're going really long durations without meals, I want to understand why. Because like one of the slides that I have here, like I have a lot of students who don't eat all day because they feel so ashamed of their body. But when you don't eat all day, I mean, hold your breath, right? Suppress your urge to breathe for 5 minutes. Just go ahead and do it whenever you're ready, right? What's going to happen? You're gonna gasp for breath, right? So you're gonna overventilate for a little while to try to make up for that space. And when we try to suppress our appetite by not eating for long periods of time, it's very natural and normal to then respond by eating a lot more. And so that isn't to say that this is about weight necessarily, but they're out of sync with what their body needs. But it can also be driven by the shame that they feel about their body. Does that make sense?
Sure. And obviously a lot to unpack and try to figure out. But I think that's a helpful thing in terms of trying to like separate those different pieces.
And I'll share too, yeah, I'll ask, give me your follow-up too in a second, but I'll share too, I know people are really concerned about COVID and children having gained weight and adults having gained weight. It's a very, when we look at the thing for adults in particular, I think it was 47% have gained weight and 26% have lost the same amount of weight, right? But we don't talk about that because we think that weight loss is welcome, when in reality they're all stress responses.
Sure.
Right? When you're emotionally stressed, when you're physically stressed, the cortisol levels are going to change in your body. That may change health behaviors, but it could just change the biology by itself. So the fix for that is not necessarily restricting food. The fix can be how do we help resolve some of the stress? How do we help people so it all depends on the person.
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that stems from this, and I've had questions for you all the time, just being, a platform being an app and different things, that we think about within apps, like you mentioned, some of the food trackers and everything else like that. Often that's like the first go-to in terms of trying to like put it all into perspective. Can you just outline a little bit further sort of the delineation you make between sort of that journal and log that you do, why you would suggest that model, and like what are the benefits to that in terms of like maybe students contextualizing things versus like just, hey, throw it into an app and see where it goes?
You just said it. It's contextualizing things, right? It's putting the decision into a curious space. So when you're using an app, right, one of the first things that they do is they almost always assume you're trying to change your weight in some way, shape, or form, right? So there's always that overplay to it. And the information in the apps can be really inconsistent because it depends where they're getting the information.
Sure.
Right. So if you use MyFitnessPal, for example, you can get a wide number of variations for how many calories an apple has. And some of those calories don't have any carbs, right? Because some of the information that's entered is standardized and other information is just entered by users and they don't have to enter all of the information. So you get really inconsistent pictures of what someone is actually eating. You're not getting the full display of their vitamins and minerals and even their macronutrient breakdown.
Sure.
And the other thing is that since it's based on weight, they really focus on calories, and and there's not really opportunity to get curious about timing of food, about purpose of food, about responses to food. There are other apps that do have more kind of open-ended, like more like you just take a picture and then you reflect on that. Like that's another nice way to do it where it isn't quite so invasive.
Sure.
But the problem with a lot of the apps is they really encourage you to be critical, right? They encourage you to say, this is the standard, meet the standard. You didn't do it, you failed. But we all have room to grow. And for some of us, we have a long way to go, right? From where we're starting. It all just depends.
Yeah, absolutely. So one more question, Rebecca, and while we do go to that, do you mind just clicking over to the final slide just so we have our contact info up on the screen?
Sure.
If people do have additional questions or questions that they'd rather ask individually or personally, please reach out to me. My email is down there at doug@plt4m.com. A lot of times I can help answer things that are a little bit more, just platform related. And if Rebecca is in need of a nutrition answer, we can definitely loop her in as well. And I can kind of send it her way. And she does a great job of responding via email to answer more specific questions that teachers or folks might have. So please feel free to reach out to me if you do. Before we wrap up, Rebecca, I think one of the things that stands out, you mentioned it a few different ways in terms of like how we meet kids in these conversations. And I think that's often one of the hardest things that teachers have to navigate is having a big classroom full of students that, like you said, all are coming with very different experiences and very different ways of going about kind of thinking of their nutrition. When you look at like the larger group setting and kind of think about how to address a lot of these more sensitive subjects, do you have any just tips or best practices in terms of thinking about like just even ways to approach these conversations that aren't going to leave kids feeling like, upset or this isn't for me, or I'm just going to tune X, Y, and Z out because it doesn't fit what I'm looking for?
Oh, it's hard. Yeah, because your body is in the room, right? And when you're talking about weight, there's always the assumptions that go along with it. Ooh, the yeah, I think that's where it's helpful to frame it. I guess I'm easy tips, Doug. Is that what you're looking for? It is hard to have a really honest group discussion about some of these things, right? Where people are treated differently, for their size and based upon their appearance. And how do you have honest conversations, right? Where you're calling that out. It could be things like, trying to understand the history of some of these metrics that we use, right? Like there's lots of really great information about understanding the history of BMI, wherein you're not going to like point fingers at any given student, right? But you're really going to say, why is this our standard? Why
Right.
is this what we are working towards trying to achieve? It can be looking at things like, Google weight neutral, right? Like that is the kind of the place to look at, is just look at weight neutral curriculums. They do exist. There are other dietitians as well who I'm happy to connect you with that have really great curriculums about some of those big classroom discussions. Other things that are helpful are things like journaling, right? Where you're giving people reflection questions and you're giving them a safe space that no one else sees to be able to answer some of these questions,
Sure.
right? About how they feel about themselves, their relationship with food. Doing social media explorations again in your own way, like who are you following? How does it make you feel to
Yeah.
follow these people? Right. I think it's giving the question. It doesn't always have to be a group discussion necessarily, but giving the space for like, maybe there's another way that we can think about this, or to understand things like, for a lot of students, kids hate coming to see me because I'm a dietitian and a personal trainer. Anytime a child comes in and they're referred for weight, they sit in the corner with their head down, so sad, because just the action of coming to me is a stigma, right?
Right.
They think they've done something wrong to be there. And so trying to unpack that and say, it's not about your size. You are who you are, and there's value in that, and helping people see their value beyond their appearance, right? But
Sure.
also unpacking it's like, let's just look at what you eat. Are you eating what you need? If you are, move on.
Yeah.
So
No, I think that's good. And I think, as you said, breaking down some of the assumptions and just like, BMI or anything else like that, just assuming that that's like the gold standard and thinking about critically, why are those things exist and what do they actually mean? And like you said, they're built into the platform modules that you've created with us, as well as a lot of other great educational stuff. And I think additionally, just those small conversations or anything else like that can go, just as far of a way. So with the,
yeah.
go ahead and then we'll wrap up as we are coming up on the
Sure.
on the
Yeah.
hour.
And I think, just challenging some of the diet things that are happening in a lot of our students, particularly eating disorder wise. I think that is especially important. We have so many students skipping lunch, not eating lunch, taking supplements, just anything they do to look a certain way rather than living a certain way. So
Yeah.
helping them understand that, I had one student come up to me after I did a lecture and she's like, you mean it's not normal to throw up after lunch? And I was like, no, and all of her friends did it, right? So because her social circles were all doing the exact same thing, she was the first time that she had heard that maybe throwing up after lunch wasn't a really great idea.
Right. Right. And I think, like you said, being able to take the places that kids get a lot of information via social media and actually break it down and try to compare it to science and evidence, but also real world application, like you said at the very beginning, is challenging but worthwhile. And a lot of the state and national standards around nutrition, and physical education and wellness actually are connected in a lot of ways to thinking about, like, how does this apply to your everyday life, and how do you interact with social media? What can you pull out to be true versus misinformation, and all of those different things? So I think that's a really great place to close. And we've
Yeah.
certainly had a great hour in terms of a full webinar and some great Q&A as well with Rebecca. So Rebecca, thank you so much for spending an hour with us and breaking all this helpful stuff down.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for making this available for folks. I wish I had it when I was in high school.
Absolutely. So check out all of our nutrition content. There's a lot of sample content on our blog. You'll be able to see some of that as well. When we do send out the recording, we'll link out a few of those pieces so that you can explore it a little bit. And if you are a platform user, you have all access to all of the different platform modules that Rebecca broke down, from an intro to nutrition all the way up to some of the weight stuff that we talked about today. It's all there with written lessons, videos, and everything in between. So sit tight, be on the lookout for a recording, a certificate of attendance for those that were able to join us. And as always, please reach out with questions that you might have along the way. We want to be a helpful resource in this conversation around health and wellness for our students. So thanks so much. Be in touch, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks all.